Paul Morphy played an amazing collection of instructive attacking games. This is a game that I saw as a young player, and it always inspired me to focus on development, tempo, and castling in the beginning of the game. I won many of my favorite personal games as a result of the lessons in this game. Here, we're going to see Schulten just get a bit too greedy and lose sight of his opening principles and lose a miniature to Paul Morphy as a result. Schulten begins the game with e4, e5, and pawn f4. This game is played less than a decade after the famous Immortal game, which is still one of the most famous games in chess history. And so at that time, the King's Gambit was at the height of its popularity. People loved to offer the King's Gambit. However, Paul Morphy was not like other players of the day who was going to feel honor-bound to accept the King's Gambit and then suffer as White tried to attack. Instead, he's going to seek open lines and activity for his own pieces right away. He does that with pawn d5, offering a counter gambit which is still very good this day. After pawn takes d5, currently the most popular and probably best choice is simply to delay the capture of the pawn and now play pawn takes f4. I play the King's Gambit. I hate this particular way to deny the King's Gambit. Please don't do this against me. Anyway, Morphy decides to play pawn e4, trying to establish a cramping pawn in the center of the board. This is also an interesting way to play. Schulten now probably should have played d3, which is currently understood to be the best way to respond and to try to trade off this cramping pawn. Instead, Schulten tries knight c3, and Morphy plays knight f6, and here's where Schulten really makes an early opening error. He plays pawn d3 at this point. Challenging the center pawn makes a lot of sense, but Morphy is going to be able to develop and open lines rapidly and with tempo gaining moves, so this move is already a mistake, and instead queen e2 would have been a better move. So after d3, Morphy plays bishop b4, pinning the knight. By the end of this game, John Schulten is going to hate the word pin, and if you're learning about pins, hopefully you will really understand them well by the end of this game. So bishop d2 is played, developing and breaking the pin, and Morphy plays a really nice move here, one of my favorite early opening moves. I remember seeing this game when I was like, I don't know, 12 or 13 or something, and being like, oh, I want to play like this. Can you do this all the time? He plays pawn e3, giving up his pawn. He's going to have sacrificed 2 pawns after the acceptance of this pawn to keep the e-file open, anticipating the great attack he achieves on the e-file, and to continue gaining time with the moves he plays in the opening. So the bishop, of course, really has to capture here, and now Morphy castles. Note that in Morphy's games, a lot of times he ends up castled and his opponents do not. Castling is not just a defensive move, it is also really valuable for allowing you to be aggressive and to get your rooks into the game. Morphy appreciates that and always finds the right time to castle in his games. So the bishop now steps back again to defend and break the pin, and I think at this point Morphy plays the one really significant kind of inaccuracy that he plays in this game. He trades on c3, and instead there's lots of other good moves. You could play here, I think, just rook e8. You could play pawn c6, but don't go ahead and trade on c3. You're kind of losing some time and giving up a bishop that could still have been really valuable, especially in the context of White having pushed f4 and opened up his dark squares. So in any case, Morphy does make the trade on c3 here. We get pawn takes c3, rook e8 check, bishop e2 developing and blocking, and bishop g4, another pin, right? We've got the rook on the e8 lining up here when the bishop on g4 is putting more pressure on this bishop on e2, and already we can see that Schulten's in a real bind. Like, he would like to play knight f3, but then bishop takes f3 happens, and you have to take with the g-pawn, and your king will know no safety in this game. It's not lost, but it's not good either. So instead, Schulten displays a bit of a greedy side, and I can't blame him for this just because I can't recommend any better move. He plays pawn c4, trying to hold on to this pawn on d5. Morphy now plays pawn c6, another really nice move, chipping away at this pawn center and looking to get his knight in with a gain of time. Now, Schulten goes along with this, and it's really the losing move in this game. Schulten's going to capture on c6, and there's no salvation after that. Morphy's pieces are all over the white position. Instead, playing pawn h3 here seems to be the best move. There are some other tries that you might make as well, and after a trade here, and black captures on d5, gaining his pawn back, it's a very, very interesting game. Morphy has compensation, but white is not busted here, and the game can go on. So this is a really good example of how you often need to give back a little material when you're up a pawn, or in this case 2 pawns, to be able to finish development. And if Schulten had sensed that here, the game would have finished differently and probably wouldn't be as famous as it is today. So instead, Schulten responds to c6 by going ahead and capturing on c6. Of course, Morphy just recaptures with the knight. That's what he really wanted to do. And now we find that there's really not a good move for Schulten. I mean, there's literally no good move. The threat of knight d4 is tremendous. If you look at black's pieces, they are just leveraging all kinds of pressure on the white position, and white has one piece, the bishop on e2, developed. Really, that's all you need to understand this position. No variations, etc. Black is just so much more developed, and there's so much pressure in this position. You cannot hold this for white. At this point, Schulten finds, I think, the most testing move, so credit to him on that front. He plays king f1. This move steps out of the pin that's been causing so much problems, and he threatens to play bishop takes g4, easing the pressure and potentially saving the game. Now, Morphy has to respond with energy, but he's Paul Morphy, so he's going to do that. And he plays rook takes e2, which is correct, is totally decisive, and is basically the only winning move. Fantastic. The knight develops now, but it develops into a pin, a different pin than we had before, right? We were leveraging pressure on the e file and pressuring that. Now we're really focusing on the pressure on d1, which we had before too, but that's the critical point now. So at this point, Morphy goes ahead and plays knight to d4, and there's no way to save this knight on e2, and when it goes, white's going to technically be okay on material, but really because of the difference in development, this is a busted position. Schulten tries the move queen b1. I don't know why he picked queen b1, but I can't really recommend a saving move, so I'm not going to pick on him too much for this. It does call to mind the queen b1 move that Letellier played against Fischer in our other game. Check out the card if you want to check out that game, but this really does feel like almost the same move that Letellier played against Fischer in that very kind of different but equally decisive game from another American genius 100 years later. So after queen b1, we get bishop takes e2. Now, you don't really have any good king moves. I'll mention that king g1 runs into a really nice move. There's knight takes c2, which hits the trapped rook over here. It's a clearance sacrifice because if the queen captures, there's queen to d4. You can block with the bishop. I take it. It's checkmate. Beautiful, beautiful checkmate. So the other alternative is after bishop takes e2 to go to e1, but I'm not really going to dive into a deep analysis here. You just point the queen at the king on the e file, and it's just crushing, right? You're killing the white king here, and none of white's pieces are helping out. So the king tries f2, which does make the most sense, but we get hit with knight g4 here. And now the king tries to hide on g1, hoping that the king will be safe here. Of course, it's not. This is a good point to pause your video and try to figure out how you would play if you were Paul Morphy in this position. So what Paul Morphy did, and it's not the only winning move, check the notes for some alternatives, but what Paul Morphy did was he played knight f3 check here. Pawn takes f3, queen d4 check. That was a clearance sacrifice, just trying to get the knight off of d4 with a gain of time so that the queen can come in. The king steps up, nowhere else to go. Queen check, king up, queen takes pawn with check, king up. And now it's pretty clear you just need to move the knight because you need to put your queen on this g4 square. The only question is where to move the knight to deny white any hope of saving the game. Morphy picks what seems to be the best move. Knight e3 is basically equally good, but this way the knight gets to f5, and that's game over. Queen g1 was played in the game, and then knight check, king up, and queen h5 check with a unique mate. I've never seen a mate quite like this before. A beautiful king hunt with the king being driven all the way up to g5. I hope that you enjoyed this game. If you did, also check out our video on Paul Morphy versus Alonzo Morphy, Paul Morphy's father, where he offers rook sacrifices and finishes with an even more spectacular king hunt in the fried liver attack.